I'm Dennis Edwards, Seminary Dean and Vice President of Church Relations at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. I've been thinking about how the early church was a disruptive force in society. And what I mean by disruptive is that they challenged the status quo of life in the Roman Empire. I mean, one example is how the Christians were sharing the message in a city called Thessalonica, and they were pretty much run out of town. But it says there that people accuse them of disrupting the whole world, or some translations say turning the world upside down. This is evidence that the Christians were making the rest of the world uncomfortable, but they weren't doing it because they were a violent bunch or because they were an arrogant bunch or because they were somehow subversive in the traditional ways we might think of subversion. They were instead people who loved each other, and they were people who communicated that love even to their enemies. The church was disruptive because they refused to give in to the violent way of Rome. They also refused to give in to the way Roman society was stratified. Roman society had a very hierarchical way of life, with people on top exploiting those on the bottom, enslaving people, a patriarchal society that diminished women and disrespected women. And the Christians come along and you hear words like, in Christ, there's not male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. We're one. This is a revolutionary kind of a statement. Same thing happens, or a similar thing happens over in Colossians chapter 3, where Paul says, neither slave, free, Jew, Greek, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian. These contrasts are the way society operated. But the Christians, it wasn't supposed to be that way. So they subverted their culture by saying, we're supposed to be one in Christ. We are people who love each other, who share together. And their way of life really challenged the status quo of Rome. That's disruptive. But in that disruption, they attracted some people who wanted to know what this new life and sense of community is really about. And that becomes an opportunity for people to see who Jesus is. Even though Jesus had already been raised from the dead, already ascended to glory, people were starting to love and know and follow Jesus by the Spirit of God when they saw how Christians were living and saw how they challenged the oppressive, violent, and hierarchical ways of Rome. So for me, there's a model in that and how I can follow that way the early Christians operated. One virtue that I like to highlight when I think about the Christians' disruptive way of life is the virtue of humility. There are several passages in the New Testament that talk about humility, but the way Christians thought about this was not the way the Romans thought about it. They would see humility as something that would bring shame, that you would actually defer in some way or yield yourself to the gods in some way so that you didn't highlight yourself. Well, the Christians took this way of humility, this way of submitting to God and deferring to one another as the way of Christ. It's like it says in Philippians that we should consider others even more important than ourselves. So it becomes really disruptive for society when you've got a group of people who love each other, defer to each other, submit themselves to God, learn how to even submit themselves to each other, and show that there's a way of being that is not competitive and cutthroat, but one that's collaborative, one that brings people together, one that celebrates who we really can be as human beings. That is the kind of disruption I think we still need in our society. There are some ways that the disruptive way of life of the early Christians can be carried out even in our times. There are ways that we can practice humility, not in an episodic fashion, but as kind of a cultivated way of life where we can learn how to share and be with one another. I think of some of my pastoral experiences where I've been in churches where conflict emerged. and people were struggling to get to resolve this conflict. We didn't listen well to each other. We wanted to get our own way. We learned, and it was tough, but we learned that we needed to listen well, and not just in a passive way, but in an active way, to say, I want to listen and learn what my sisters and brothers are thinking and feeling so that we can make a decision together. I think this happens in some churches, particularly in light of racial and ethnic tension in our society. We have churches that want to be multicultural or multi-ethnic and don't really know how to do that. Or they satisfy themselves with a picture of diversity rather than living into a reality where power is shared. So for me, humility says those people who have enjoyed relative power and status in society need to not just listen, but learn from those who have been in the more vulnerable position. That's the kind of humility I think the early church was starting to learn and practice, and what we can do today. So that means when we're in our church fellowship, having meals together, we are not just in the same place, but we are learning what it means to defer and listen to those who've been on the margin and who have been taken advantage of, and receive what they have to say so that we can reshape how we are doing church. I think humility plays out in those kinds of conversations and those kinds of meals. I think also in the way we worship together. We could fight about the stuff that we sing. Some churches argue about even worship singing. But I think if we were to practice humility, we would say, music has an educational role. We sort of catechize with music. So music might be a way where we want to defer to those who are younger in the faith, who need to learn some things, rather than give in to those who have power and want simply their style and preferences to be advanced. So there's another opportunity for us to listen to those who don't always get listened to.